Star Wars 7x7 episode 2214. Today, an interview with Cole Horton, or should I say Eloc Throno, who is the author of The Galaxy's Edge Traveler's Guide to Batuu. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So, funnily enough, the Star Wars Book of Lists and the Traveler's Guide to Batuu were supposed to come out on the same day in June, and they did not. Ultimately, the Traveler's Guide was delayed a month, and so it came out just this past Tuesday. But because both books are published by Becker and Mayer, the arrangements for interviews happened at essentially the same time. And so back in June, I did 2 interviews with Cole back to back, one that was specific to the Book of Lists and one that was specific to the Traveler's Guide to Batuu. And so I shared the first of them, the Book of Lists interview, when the Book of Lists came out, or at least not long afterward. And now I am pleased to share with you the other interview that I did back on that day in June, which is the interview with Eloc Throno, aka Cole Horton, who is the author of The Traveler's Guide to Batuu. And we'll dig into all sorts of stuff about how a guide like this is created in just a moment. I do want to say thank you, as always, for joining me, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Cole Horton about The Traveler's Guide to Batuu. I am thrilled to welcome back onto the show the author of Volcanic Planets, your guide to the galaxy's hottest destinations, as well as the Galaxy's Edge Traveler's Guide to Batuu, Eloc Throno, or should I say Cole Horton. How are you today?
I'm good. I guess we're good. I guess I'm both of those people.
Yes.
And in theory, I've written a large number of books as this fictional author here. This was a unique book in terms of just who even writes it.
So is this your first book that you've written as an in-universe book?
The first one, probably all the way through. So I've done some others that have just like bits and pieces. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I did an update to the 3D owner's manual for the Millennium Falcon, and you'd have to put in like in-universe statements from like Han Solo or Lando Calrissian or something like that. But yeah, this is sort of unique, and in a lot of Star Wars publishing, there's only been a handful of books that sort of take on this sort of approach of it's written in universe by a single in-universe author. So yeah, it was my first time doing that, and I didn't hide it very well because Eloc Throno, of course, is just a jiggering of my name.
Yep.
But yeah, I kind of had to, out of the gates, invent some kind of travel guide character to be there in that world and take readers through it as well.
So when the project was initially proposed, was it proposed as a book to be written by an in-universe character or not?
Yeah, it was. So the brief on this one was specific in that it was going to be in-universe. Mm-hmm. It needed to be about not just Black Spire Outpost and just that like little chunk of Batuu that you get to visit when you go to the land at Disneyland Resort or Walt Disney World. It needed to cover the whole planet, and past that, they were pretty wide open with what could be in there. They provided me a lot of resources and documents to help, but I'd say the editors at Becker and Mayer, the editors at Lucasfilm, and this time we were working with Walt Disney Imagineering as well. Like the team that was working on Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, the theme parks, were like hand in hand with this, and they were super open and great to work with as well. So I kind of got to like take it from there and put in whatever I thought was interesting.
So where in time was this book written in comparison to the development of Galaxy's Edge and the actual opening of the land at the various Disney properties?
Yeah, so in the real world, I wrote this before either location had opened. So I'd say 99% of this book was done before I had seen it, actually.
Oh. So even not getting to go behind the scenes and see it being built?
Yeah, no, this was all written remotely from my office in San Francisco. And yeah, they provided me with this like amazing tome of information, all the backstories, and it was basically like the working like Bible to the project. And so everyone who's working on the project seemed to kind of have this, like this was the reference for anyone who touched the project. And there are, hundreds, thousands of people who touched this project. And so they gave me that, and it was really the number one resource. It had a little bit of everything, including maps. So the first thing I had to figure out was, I knew there were going to be two versions of this park, right? One on the West Coast and one down in Florida. And the first thing I didn't know is, are they the same? Because again, nothing had really been announced. Like we had seen the big model at D23 Expo,
right.
But I didn't know if they were different or something had changed. So the first thing I did was get in there and confirm that, yeah, they're actually surprisingly the same. I think, Uber fans will, of course, find differences and little things here and there. But certainly the sort of like layouts and the brick and mortar and all the structures are very similar. So the good news was I didn't have to write two versions of this guidebook. And then they were able to provide me with some really cool photography. So they took that model that was on display at D23 Expo and had been used in the development of the project. And they were able to get in there like on ground level with cameras and almost provide me like a ground level view of everything, of every street and every building. And so I could look at the map, I could look at, or I could read all the descriptions, and then I could look at these photos and really get a sense for like where things were in the space. Because I very quickly had to decide, how does someone arrive on Batuu? Or what's the like most logical path someone might take if they were taking sort of a walking tour of Black Spire Outpost? And I knew there were multiple entrances. And then when you're in there, right, it's like streets and alleyways and paths. And I had to find one that would be logical and you wouldn't miss anything. So that was a challenge because, again, I hadn't been there. Right. I'm going off of a PDF document and some pictures. But with all of that combined, you kind of get a sense for the space. Now, that said, I wrote it, and it felt like Black Spire was big. And I wrote it as such. And you kind of write it as if it's even bigger than the physical space might be at the parks. But then I got there. I'm like, oh no, it's even bigger than I thought. Like I was just sort of taken aback at like just how big it is, and just like the Falcon. I don't know if you've been.
I have not
yet. I think you'll experience when you go. You walk up to the Falcon, and it just feels. And you've been thinking about this thing your whole life. Right? Like this ship inside and out. I've written books about that ship. But when you see it in real life, it's even bigger and it's even better.
Oh, wow.
And that was the thing that like, I hope I conveyed. And I don't know, maybe you can't convey it. Like maybe people just need to get there and actually see this space because it's like the Black Spire, right? This giant, tree that's sort of in the middle. It's huge. It's all huge. And that was really cool to sort of discover when I got there. Thankfully, I didn't discover really anything that I got entirely wrong. Thanks to hopefully me doing my homework, but of course, all the great editorial support and all the great support from everybody at Walt Disney Imagineering and Lucasfilm Story Group, and the Lucasfilm editors, my editors, I think we got it right. Even with not being able to be there. Now, because of sort of how long the book takes to develop, and especially all the imagery and stuff like that, the lands, both of them had opened by the time we had to go to print or something. So we were able to get in there and get some different photography, confirm everything was right, and double check. But yeah, books take a long time. Before I got into this publishing world, I think I had no idea how long a book takes. I tend to have probably the shortest amount of time with it because there's just so much, especially when you're working with so many different partners. It's a lot of eyes and a lot of feedback, and it's all good, but it takes time. And then the poor designers, they're brilliant, and they have the hard job. They made the book feel kind of unique and different. like the visual style. It's readable, but it had to kind of feel like it was in universe as well. And there's not a lot of books in universe.
No,
right?
there are
Ray
not.
has some ancient ones, and so like you had to like, what would a book feel like? And so I hats off to them, because they pulled it off and made it feel like it could actually exist.
Yeah. So tell me about the character of Eloc Throno. Was there, and am I pronouncing that correctly?
I think so. Yeah, it's Star Wars. You can pronounce it however you want, but yeah, that's how I say it.
So, did you actually, do work on developing this character and who he might be and what his place in the world is? Obviously, there's stuff in the book about him, about a little bio at the end, which is fantastic. But and his philosophy for how he approaches writing travel books like this.
Yeah, there was a ton of backstory I created, and there were multiple inspirations that were used. So in terms of backstory, I originally had something even more in depth than what you see in the final, like about the author section near the back. But even in that, I was able to capture like where he went to school, which is actually a reference to another book that was also written in universe.
Ah, okay.
Yes. So Amel Fortune is, I think, the character who, my character studied under. That was from the Galactic Atlas. Is the recent kind of bigger book with lots of maps in it. That was another book that was written sort of in the same way, with the same conceit. So like I was like, oh, that's cool. Well, I'm gonna make some connection to that. And then I had this whole backstory, even like why this character would know what he knew, and especially the thing that it had that I wanted. I just wanted, because I think it's cool and I liked them growing up, was blueprints for all the various ships you're going to see, right?
Right.
Well, why would this travel writer have these blueprints? Like I couldn't figure that out, like some excuse for that. And then I realized, oh, he'd have a droid. And his droid could scan all those things. So I had this whole like backstory about the droid, and I think I had a droid's name and little sketches of what the droid would look like. And then we didn't end up needing any of that. Like, it was just sort of too much. But in my head, that's what we had. From an inspiration standpoint, I looked two places. The first was those old like West End RPG guides, which I would always read as a kid. Even though I wasn't playing the game, I loved like all the information. It would just have lists of technology and blasters and backpacks and all that stuff that your character would need for the RPG. And I kind of wanted to have a little element of that, because I envisioned people who hadn't been yet on their vacation, sitting at home kind of figuring out like who's their character, who are they going to be in this world, and you would want a lot of that information to kind of help you out.
Yeah. So
I looked at that a lot, pulled out some of my old West End RPG reference books that from the 90s. The other thing I thought about a whole lot was other travel guides, and particularly Rick Steves, the public television personality who's been doing this for a long time. And his guides to Europe are my wife and I's favorites. We've been to his events in Washington. We're huge Rick Steves fans, and he was always sort of another inspiration. And the way Rick Steves is able to bring to life like the history of a place is very important. Sort of the tone, the way he talks about that, the way that Rick makes his travel guides, and all, credit to all the other people who work on those books with Rick Steves as well. Yeah. They make everything kind of feel personal, and they're not afraid to infuse a little bit of opinion or their personal experience into things, which I love in the travel guide, but it's also really helpful in a book like this, because it does explain why, like why are you peppering in like facts about people's personalities and their relationships? Well, it's because this character knows these people. Like Rick Steves might know somebody who owns a hotel in France. And then just the way that it kind of balances like interesting information and context and the sort of like feel of a place with the information you need to make your way through that place. And so they're not just these like transactional kind of impersonal books. They somehow juggle being like kind of art and the science of travel. And I wanted a lot of that in there. So Rick Steves' guides were a good bit of that. I think, kind of a difference from all of those things, even the RPG books is just how visual this one is. We do have a lot of imagery in there, and we rely on that. And it is full color and everything. So it's a little bit different in that respect. It's not just a dry kind of travel guide, that like thin, I call it Bible paper, that like those travel guides, they're just so dense. This is not that. This is a much higher quality stock and meant to be more visual along with all the information. Now that said, I think I came in about twice as long on word count than it was originally briefed for.
Oh, really?
I just couldn't stop myself from writing some stuff. Or it was just kind of hard to decide what wasn't going to go in. And I knew that this might be the only place where a lot of these backstories that had been developed got told. There were, of course, other tie-ins and, other authors working in this space and telling some of these stories and expanding on Batuu and Black Spire Outpost. And that continues till today. But this was the place where we could try to capture all of it at once. And I don't know, I just got greedy. I wanted all of it in there, and it was hard to let go. So I chose to turn it into a book that was twice as long and let the poor editors and designers figure it out. And they did. So it worked out.
Excellent. I'm going to step out of interview mode for a second because I have just realized that I do not have a power cord plugged in on my computer. So.
Oh, yep.
And I don't want to lose this thing in the middle of it. So I'm going to disappear off camera for a second.
That's fine. I'm checking mine now too. You've got me spooked.
All right.
Now you've got to edit. How much editing do you normally do?
Not a lot, as it turns out. I mean, most of the conversation, I would say, it's not like I'm editing out ums and ahs and that sort of thing. So
yeah.
It's very little that I have to do, actually. The real editing is more with the introductory, where if I'm going to say, hey, I talked to Cole Horton, it was great, and this is blue. Oh, shoot, stop.
Yeah.
Start over. Yeah, and so that's where it happens.
10-second bumper turns into like half the effort. Yep.
Exactly. So the whole notion of jump cuts in videos on YouTube, once I got used to that being the norm, then it's like, okay, I just have to know what I'm going to say for about 30 seconds at a shot. And then I can stop, start, and it works out fine. So these ones comparatively feels like, walking on a tightrope, but it's generally works out okay, I would say.
Yeah.
All right, I'm back in. Are we good to continue?
Let's do it.
Awesome. So you mentioned, all of the things that you're, wanting to include in there and other authors working in the space. I wanted to ask you about that too, because you also mentioned the reference materials that you were provided. So as part of your process, are you also looking at novels like Delilah Dawson's Black Spire or Zoraida Cordova's Crash of Fate, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not going to list all the novels and comics that have touched it, but I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. Like, did that, is that part of it, or is that also just, writers are working in the space, and so you include some, you let editors bring in more? How does it work?
It kind of works in all of those ways at the same time. So the first thing, like, we're all working from the same documents. And so we're all pulling from the same space. And as long as we all kind of keep going back to that one central point, everybody can kind of stay unified, sort of no matter what happens. I know I got to hang out a little bit with Delilah at Celebration. And I was more kicking off my project, I believe, and she was more nearing the end. And so I was able to kind of pick her brain, and it's always fun to kind of run into some of the few people in the world who are also in on the secret, because this is all incredibly sensitive and you can't talk about it. So it was fun just to be able to like pick her brain and like, well, when you read about this, how did you envision that? And what are you thinking when you read this, that, or the other? So that was really great. And then, you rely on the editors at Lucasfilm and the Story Group there a lot, because they see it all and it's all kind of passing over their desks. And they can help make sure those connections are there. And even some of the late breaking stuff. One of the things that kind of hadn't been figured out yet that's in the final book is about like different celebrations that happen on Batuu at different times of the year. And it's funny because when I had my kickoff call with Walt Disney Imagineering, that meeting hadn't happened yet. Like they hadn't quite figured that out. And we just kind of had a placeholder for that. Oh, wouldn't that be cool if we could talk about that? And then later on, I kind of get a draft of the book and it's there. So somebody thankfully had remembered that discussion and made sure that made it into the final bit, even though that didn't necessarily line up with the timeline I was given for the manuscript, which is many, many, many months before the final product is done.
And speaking of timelines, my understanding is when you go to Galaxy's Edge, when you're actually in the land, that you're actually stepping into a specific day in a specific year, and it takes place in between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. So when you're writing the guide, are you writing it with the presumption that, okay, I only know what happens up through that date, and so whatever happens beyond that and in The Rise of Skywalker, like you have to close your mind off from all that stuff?
That's exactly right. Yeah, so when you visit, it's sort of like a snapshot in time between those two films. And I wrote this as if the author, Eloc, had been there about 2 weeks before you would arrive as the reader.
Yes, of course. That makes a lot of sense.
The idea was like he had been constantly updating this book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that meant, though, that he maybe didn't know a few things. So the first thing is the First Order at that point might have just barely arrived, and their presence and their intentions maybe wouldn't be extremely clear to everybody. Now, when you would arrive 2 weeks later in that universe, right, the First Order has more firmly established themselves, and they're causing more trouble, and they're doing more inspections and things like that. But he wouldn't quite know that. He also wouldn't really know what was going on out in the forest. And if you visit the land, what's going on out there, of course, is that the Resistance is setting up a base. And the idea is that he would know like something was up, and there were these Resistance things, and he would get to talk about the Resistance and its leaders and stuff like that. But he wouldn't necessarily like out their presence, right? Because the idea is that the First Order is looking for them. And if all they had to do was walk down the street and pick up the travel guide that's been in print, that would really like blow up the whole story. So he had to be a little bit dodgy there. But purposely, there were a few things that we were dodgy about as well. There are no spoilers for the attractions.
Okay.
So if you want to ride Smuggler's Run or Rise of the Resistance and you want those unspoiled, I'll tell you, I want them unspoiled. I actually tried my best to avoid Rise of the Resistance spoilers, which I still haven't had a chance to experience. What I did instead was attempt to give you, whether you knew it or not, information about things that you might come across on those attractions. But we're not going to give a beat for beat, here's what happens. Because that is like your experience that you know, as an inhabitant of this world would go experience, you know, sort of uniquely. Right. So that's not in there. And then we want to keep a couple of the other things separate as well. Like, this is not a guide to sell you merchandise at the theme park. Or I just don't go into that. Like, we don't talk about what's really for sale at all. We don't talk about T-shirts and mugs or Build a Droid or anything like that. Instead, I talk about the owner of those shops and what they make and kind of what inspired them and what motivates them and sort of why they're, you know, their approach to craftsmanship and things like that. But it's not there to sell you stuff. And I think, you know, if you want to go there and have that experience and build a droid in the droid shop, if you read the book, you're going to know, oh, this droid shop is run by Mubo, and this is his personality, and this is where he comes from, and this is how he sort of relates to everybody else, which you won't get if you just went and built a droid. So it's sort of complimentary, but not there to hawk anything. And same goes with the lightsaber experience. Okay, we're not spoiling that for you at all. And the conceit there is that my character has seen some suspicious activity going on around that. And is going to maybe talk about some things in the forest and stuff, but I'm not going to give you a beat for beat account about what happens behind those doors, because again, that's unique and special, and hopefully a guest can experience that on their own. you don't need it ruined in a book. So it all worked. It was great because you had this narrator who could know or not know things conveniently,
Right.
to still preserve that guest experience.
Mm-hmm. And with the First Order and Resistance conflict too, there are notes about the fact that both have a presence there, and I love how it focuses on the very practical. Try to avoid getting caught and in the middle of skirmishes between them, or if you're going outside Black Spire outposts, be aware that you could be increasing the odds of danger in those situations. But I was particularly impressed by the sort of neutral tone that it takes, despite the fact that there are also First Order propaganda posters in there. And I wondered how politically you approach that book, or how Eloc approaches a book like that, especially in a time of galactic upheaval.
Yeah, the idea was that he was more just like a scholar and just like intellectually curious about all of this stuff, mm-hmm. and really wasn't trying to take a side, in part because the idea is sort of that the guests can pick an allegiance. Like if you want to align yourself more with the First Order or the Resistance, you can do that. And so I didn't want to push anybody one way or the other. And yes, and I think the timeline helped with that as well, because the First Order had just got there. And actually I think I had a question in the story group that was like, how widely known is it that the First Order was responsible for the Hosnian Cataclysm? Right? Like, does the average citizen in the galaxy know about the Starkiller base? Right? And I was like, well, no, maybe they might know about Hosnian Prime and stuff blowing up and that, but they wouldn't necessarily know about Starkiller. They may not know everything that you would know as a viewer of a film. And so with that in mind, you're able to kind of like take a more neutral tone, because you're just a traveler in this galaxy, and you're not getting caught up in the galactic scale politics of it all. And instead you're kind of trying to figure it out for yourself. And much like a lot of the residents of Batuu will as well, right? Like all these shops have proprietors and owners, and of course Oga, who not only runs the cantina but really runs the whole outpost. Mm-hmm. How does she feel about this, and like what sort of tensions arise because now the First Order is bringing order, for lack of a better word, to this place where she's really had the run of the whole town for about a decade. So all that creates great tension and great information, all that can be told in universe.
So what would you say, ultimately you were learning about the place entirely based on, remote materials and so forth. What was most fascinating for you as far as, knowing that a Star Wars land had been created that you could actually step into the universe? Like for you personally, what fired your imagination the most?
I mean, I don't know, this sounds dumb, but the food. I got like really into. Okay, good. The
Any
food
answer
and the
is
beverages.
Great.
Good. Okay.
If you had said maybe the cobblestones, I would have been like, yeah, well, but no, the food. Okay, lay it on me.
Yeah,
and then
no.
Go for the cobblestones. Go ahead.
I do have a cobblestone story. Don't let me forget.
I won't. Okay, great.
Yeah, no, because there were multiple. If you're a Disney fan, there's multiple like food and beverage locations, right? And there's quick service restaurants and that sort of thing, and snack locations and all that. And all of that was there, but different in that it was so well themed and sort of dressed up and kind of revised to be more of a living thing in Star Wars. And it's funny because at first you're like, okay, here's the food, and this sort of you could approach it as, all right, I got to sell these people some food. Right. But that's not what they wanted and not what I wanted to do either. Instead, it was like, well, where did this food come from? What's the story? And thankfully, all of that existed. Like there's a reason why this food from this place is being served there. And I knew then, oh, this is a wonderful time to explain to people what these items are. Because it's not, chicken tenders. It's fried tip-yip. Right. And what's a tip-yip? Where's that come from? And so it was a great excuse to get in there and talk about that and talk about who brings it there, and also give you a little bit of the backstory around that place. So one of the locations, for the listeners who haven't been there, is a dining location that when you arrive, it has a sort of cargo ship up top, right? And that cargo ship is bringing food created by Cookie Tugs, who's a character who's actually in Maz Kanata's castle in The Force Awakens. And now, of course, in the timeline, that castle has had a rough time. And Cookie is now basically created a food truck. And he has arrived here at Black Spire, and he is the chef at the moment when you go there. And he's got dishes, and you can taste all that food. But the idea that, like, well, there's other chefs, right? Like, he's the rotating food truck who just happens to be there when you're there. But this idea that, like, others can come in and out, and talking about that, you only get that kind of from the book. A novel doesn't have time to go into that level of detail, right, and break the pacing of the story. But I'm writing a travel guide, so I can talk about that. So I thought that was really cool. The other location, so Ronto Roasters is another location that serves now famous Ronto wraps. Of course, all this was new to me. Like, I'm reading this, there's going to be Ronto wraps. I wonder what it tastes like. Luckily, there was a food and beverage sort of media event right as I was writing this. And I was able to basically read on the internet what this stuff was going to taste like. Because I had the descriptions in the materials I was provided, but I couldn't taste them. I couldn't drink the Alderanian wine. But those people could. And I don't know if you know Amy Ratcliffe, who is another author. She was part of that event. And of all the people who covered that, I think hers was the most descriptive, and I ended up using the most. So shout out to Amy, who went to this event unknowingly and tasted everything and wrote about it, and turned out to be this amazing resource for me. And I'm like word for word describing how these dishes taste, even though I've never had them. Amy had them. And so I think she got them all right. Now, having been there and actually tasted there, she did a fantastic job. And so team effort, she didn't even know it. And yeah, that ended up being a lot of fun. Cobblestones. Yes. However, so this book was not the first time I had a chance to work on Galaxy's Edge as a project. Again, thousands of people have touched this thing. I got to do very briefly just a little bit of consulting work on droids and droid related things. And one of the things we were able to do is get some dimensions and rubbings off the original sort of like treads that were on R2-D2. And the Imagineers were I've never met a more passionate group of people, like down to every detail, right? Take this rubbing and create the files, to then create the stamps, to stamp them into the concrete that was supposed to be like mud. So that as you're moving through that land, there are not just marks and tracks from where droids have been. They're like accurate to 1977. The actual R2-D2 tracks are in the concrete. Like, it's just amazing the amount of, like, no detail was too small. No expense was spared, right? It's sort of the Jurassic Park. It was amazing what they were willing to do and the passion that they poured into it. And so I was just sort of like lucky to have sort of been in the same space as that for a brief time before I got brought on to do this book. And then you go there and you see that, and you're like, wow, like that was years ago, and they remembered it all this time, and they went out of their way to do that. And it's the sort of little details that if you're just going, I think the average person on vacation may never know. But if you take time and really stare at everything has a story, and everything is there purposefully, and it's really special.
And I think you've done a fantastic job of capturing it, knowing that you couldn't possibly capture everything, because then it would be, like 18 inches thick and multi-volumed and whatnot. But I enjoyed the heck out of it, and I'm going to be referencing it again, and particularly again when I finally get the opportunity to go to Galaxy's Edge. And I will say to the universe that I hope this book is required reading for everybody who goes onto the Galactic Star Cruiser Hotel. When that opens in Walt Disney World, it should be in every room right next to the Gideon Bible, because it's a fantastic resource. And honestly, it helped me visualize it in a way that I hadn't yet visualized it, despite, having video and seeing things like that. Like, it definitely really brought it alive for me in a new and awesome way. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I hope so too. It was certainly written so that it could exist in and outside of the actual, planet of Batuu. If anyone's listening out there and they're looking up the book or maybe even going out and pre-ordering it if I can pitch something, you're going to see the image there of the cover, and there's actually a mock-up. There's a little like I don't know, piece of paper that goes on the retail versions of this thing that have the title and everything, and you'll see that in the picture. That actually comes off. The intention was that if this was ever being sold in the park itself, on Batuu and Black Spire Outpost, you wouldn't have that information, right? You wouldn't need that barcode. And it would, without that, look very in-universe. And so underneath that strip is the title, but it's all in Arabesh. So it will fit right there in universe. And so that was not my idea. I think that was the team at Becker and Mayer. Brilliant idea, and yeah, that was very much on their minds.
They've thought of everything.
Yeah.
Well, Eloc Throno, a.k.a. Cole Horton, thank you again for joining me on the show and talking about Galaxy's Edge, the Traveler's Guide to Batuu. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time and your passion.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me.
Is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2020 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.